Good morning. Chad Warmington here at the State Chamber. I want to welcome you to our 10 and 20 on the topic of vaccine mandates. As you know, the State Chamber's 10 and 20 webinars give you, our members, the opportunity to hear 10 key important facts in 20 minutes on a hot button issue. And clearly, today's topic is a very burning issue. Obviously, a lot of people paying a lot of attention to it. There's several federal items that are shaping up on vaccine mandates with a lot of moving pieces. Particularly related to the OSHA mandate requiring private employers with 100 or more employees to require vaccine or weekly testing. And so while we know that the state of Oklahoma and many other states have filed lawsuits and have received some injunctions, there's still lots of concerns about the OSHA rule. So we wanted to spend a little time today to talk to make sure you understand how Oklahoma businesses would be impacted if the courts ultimately decide that the rule is allowed to move forward. So just as a disclaimer, as you know, for us, it's our view at the State Chamber that, all or many actions that are federal or state mandates that require a vaccine or limit a business the ability to require vaccines are very short-sighted, and we've been opposed to those throughout the pandemic. And again, to be clear, whether it's coming down from the Biden administration in terms of you have to have it, or if there were to be an Oklahoma action saying that you couldn't do it, if that's what you felt was in the best interest of you and your employees and your customers. So for more than 18 months, you've been afforded the flexibility, frankly, to do what's best for your business. And we think that is the reason that Oklahoma has done so well, that we've been affording businesses lots of flexibility to handle the pandemic in ways that were smart and safe for their employees and their customers. And we're really worried that anything that would impinge on that is going to exacerbate the already really troubling workforce issues we have in the state of Oklahoma. So this is the lawyer part. Some lawyer wrote this next part. But before I introduce the speaker today, I want to clarify that this isn't considered legal advice, and we would really encourage you to contact an attorney specializing in labor law to help you determine how this mandate may apply to you in your unique situation. So let's get started. I'm pleased to welcome Jim Paretti today with us today. Jim is an experienced management side employment and labor relations attorney with Littler. He has an in-depth political and policy knowledge on labor, pension, healthcare, employment law, regulations, and legislation. And Jim is well-versed in all aspects of legislative and political processes. So his knowledge on these issues and the substance of federal labor employment policy is robust, and we're very thrilled to have him. So we're excited to welcome Jim, and Jim, take it away.
All right, thank you, Chad. Good morning, everybody. I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., where lots of stuff going on. Every time we think we know what the rules are, they change the rules or shuffle the deck or just decide to play a different game entirely. So I've been tasked with giving you 10 things in 20 minutes. I will say there are more than 10 things, and 20 minutes isn't enough for half of them. But let's go through and just give you a sort of high-level view of where we are, what's going on, and then I'd like to leave some time for questions. We've got, looks like a good, robust group, and we can do those by way of maybe Chad, you can moderate some questions towards the end. Yeah. But where this all starts, so back on September 9th, the president announces his path out of the pandemic. That includes a federal contractor executive order. It includes rules for the federal workforce, and it called on OSHA to publish an emergency temporary standard that would require vaccination for employers of 100 or more employees. On last Thursday, the 4th, they previewed that rule, and it was published on the 5th. So it went into effect on that date. They were in court the next day, and by Saturday morning on November 6th, the Fifth Circuit, which is the federal circuit court based out of Texas, had temporarily restrained the order. Folks have asked me, is that a nationwide injunction? Is that limited to the Fifth Circuit, Texas? The court wasn't really clear, but we certainly view them. We think they would say that it was a nationwide injunction or to a temporary restraining order. Since that time, that was last Saturday, which seems only like 3 months ago now, a number of other challenges have been filed in a number of other circuits. So the Fifth Circuit's temporary restraining order holds. They're currently debating whether or not they're going to make that a preliminary injunction, convert it to something more permanent. There have been, as other states, other private businesses, as by our count this morning, in 10 of the 12 federal circuits, there are challenges to the standard that have been filed. Most of the challenges have been from the business side, saying it's overreaching, it's beyond OSHA's authority. But we have had some unions file in some of the friendlier circuits to say, oh, it doesn't go far enough, it doesn't do enough. That's important because of what happens next. So with all these various challenges filed in the circuits, On November 16th is the date we were told. These are all going to be consolidated into a single case or a single proceeding. One of the 10 circuits in which a proceeding is pending is going to sort of be assigned as the decider. So it could be the 5th Circuit in Texas, the 11th in Florida, but like the unions went and filed in the 2nd Circuit in New York, because I think they think that's a friendlier venue to them and might be more supportive of the mandate. So we are in a little bit of a wait and see mode right now. The good news is, to the extent there's good news, nothing in this rule really becomes effective until December 5, and then a testing requirement is of January 4, which I'll talk about. So, I think in the next days to week and a half to 2 weeks, we'll get a sense of how likely the standard is to go into effect, whether it's likely to, suffer fatal flaws. I think there are a number of things that undercut OSHA's ability to do this, including that 100 employee threshold, which seems somewhat like an arbitrary number. If you've got 99 employees, you're fine. Everybody can be maskless. Nobody has to get tested or vaccinated. It's safe, safe and sound. You hire 2 more people, and suddenly your workforce is now, potentially a hazardous work site, and everyone, including those first 99, need to get a shot, need to be masked. So I think, given where we are at this stage in the pandemic, I think it is a tough road to hoe for OSHA to defend this. I'm not going to say it's definitely going down, but their track record's not been great. When they've done emergency standards like this in the past, I think of the last 6 of them in recent memory that were challenged, they lost 5 of those challenges. So, I'm advising clients right now, be thinking about what happens, what you're going to need to do if this becomes, if this thing sticks, if it becomes real. But I'm also telling folks now is not the time to, go order 500,000 tests or be ready to start telling folks we're going to, separate you if you're not vaccinated. I do think there's a little bit of a wait and see here. And finally, before I turn to the substance, it's been clear, OSHA's made clear, they're not going to be paratrooping into offices on January 5 to say, show us your vaccination cards and make sure you're in compliance. I think the effort here is going to be, quote, good faith compliance. So I wouldn't say do nothing, but if, this thing lasts and January rolls around, if you're able to say, hey, we've rolled out a policy, we've done the steps we're supposed to do, we are starting to, make sure we've gotten our folks vaccinated, or we set up a testing regime. I think as long as you are making efforts to comply, you'll be in a better space. What's in this ETS? I'm going to go through this very quickly because I have about 10 minutes. Essentially, it's 100 or more employees. And other than folks who are working fully remotely, and by that I mean, 100%, maybe they're, call center type employees who just work from home. You might not have ever seen their faces in the workplace. It applies to all employees, subject to some exceptions that we'll talk about. I've put up on the bottom of the slides, and I think these slides will be distributed, detailed FAQs. They're actually pretty good. Sometimes the frequently asked questions don't give you much. I think these are better than usual. So I would encourage everyone, as you think about compliance and answer the questions I'm not going to be able to answer today, to take a look at those FAQs. As I said, what's required, you'll need to have a written vaccination policy. You need to distribute certain information to your employees. And really it's, you either need to get back, proof of vaccination, or establish a weekly 7-day testing regime. Anybody who's gotten at least 1 shot by January 4 is outside of the testing requirements. If they haven't gotten that 2nd shot, but they're en route, technically you're going to be supposed to be testing them. People have said, when do I count my 100? It was November 5, the date the standard was issued and became effective. So if you had more than 100 employees as of that date, the standard covers you. I've had folks say, well, what if I, let a few folks go, or we have attrition? Do we fall below 100? Are we outside of the mandate? And the answer is no. Once you're in, you're in. Alternately, if you have 95 employees, you're not covered right now. But if you hire 6 more, you get to that 101 or 101 number, you are covered. And then even if those 6 employees end up leaving or separating, once you're in, at least for as long as the standard lasts. If you stay under, you're out, but once you find your way in, you're in. Notably important, there are a number, as I mentioned, of different requirements out there. Some are applicable to federal contractors. So if you are a federal contractor or have this language incorporated into a federal contract at your work site, you will be following those rules, not the rules of the ETS. It's OSHA. They've tried to coordinate and said, we have a Medicare, Medicaid rule, we have a federal contractor rule, we have an ETS rule. Find the one that's applicable to you, and that's the one you're gonna follow. You don't have to be trying to track compliance with multiple orders. Big question for a lot of folks, and Chad sort of made references at the top of the call. What are the interactions here with state and local law? I'm sure you've all seen in Texas, the governor had issued an executive order, which doesn't prohibit vaccine mandates, but certainly does limit the ability of employers to not grant exemptions, particularly around, say, like prior COVID and others. OSHA's position is that if this standard preempts any state law relating to masking or testing or vaccinating. So if it is found to be lawful and valid, I think there's a strong defense that any state law that sort of stood in the way of the ETS would be preempted. On the flip side, they're trying to sort of have their cake and eat it too. They've said that state laws that provide greater protection to employees, maybe it's more time off for getting vaccinated or more time off for recovery. Those are not preempted. So this really, they're trying to set a floor rather than a ceiling. Ultimately, you're going to have, if this thing becomes effective, you have two choices, really. You can do what I call a hard mandate, which is everybody must be vaccinated, except for a limited number of exceptions on the board. People with a medical condition, people with a temporary, maybe I've had exposure to COVID and it's not recommended that I get the vaccine. Or finally, the sort of the catch-all, which is going to be religious or disability-related accommodations. And I will tell you, as my clients have rolled out some of these mandates, even prior to the ETS, when folks are starting to say, we want to get back to work, we're going to require vaccination. The religious and disability exemptions are very big. There's a lot to handle there. There's a lot to process there. We found a lot of folks that, found ways to say, oh, I can't get the shot because of how it was developed, or because I have a religious objection to, taking certain substances into my body. If you don't have proof of acceptable vaccination, the rule would require you to test unvaccinated employees, weekly testing, meaning once every 7 days. If you are someone who comes into the office maybe once a month, they'd only have to test before they come in. But also, most notably, even to the extent it's, we have state and local mask mandates currently in place, but this would require anyone who is unvaccinated in the workplace to wear a mask. So really, the question for you is, what do I want to do? Do I want to do that hard mandate and say it's vaccine or exemption? Do I want to do the soft mandate, which is vaccine, and I'll allow you to test out? OSHA does not require you to offer that to your employees. And if you do, it's probably going to be at your expense. So I have some employers who are saying, we're going to go with a hard mandate. We're only going to give exceptions to folks who have protected, those protected categories. I have others who, for a lot of reasons, including, as Chad alluded to, workforce availability, workplace, labor shortages, are saying, if I put a hard mandate, I'm going to lose too many of my employees. I'm going to have to close restaurants. I'm going to have to close facilities. So they are looking at the possibility of including a testing option. I've got on the screen, again, you'll look at the cards. How do you prove vaccination status? They give a number of documents or things that are indicative of proof. Prior to the ETS, things like an attestation, I, Jim Paretti, certified a you employer that I got my shot on this date. That was sufficient prior to the ETS. Going forward, those will be generally not sufficient. They are not going with the honor system. In the rare instances where someone has lost a card and can't find proof of vaccination, they'd have to sign a form that says, yes, I was vaccinated. Most importantly, I understand that false information may result in criminal penalties. I would say also result in discipline as an employer. So you're going to be looking to collect vaccination cards or other information from public health database that the employee can provide to you. What else is required? Under the ETS, if it applies, you're up to 4 hours of paid time off to go get a shot, to get the vaccination shot. That's up to 4 hours, doesn't have to be the full 4 hours, and that's per dose. But again, be mindful of state and local requirements. I don't know that I am not fully versed in where we are in Oklahoma as of this morning, but we certainly have states where they've required additional testing time, additional vaccination time, additional time off. And this vaccination time is required even if you are offering your employees the test out option. Similarly, paid time off for recovery from side effects. If you have someone who gets the shot and has that day or two that they're down, the ETS requires a reasonable time for side effects. They say that's generally going to be up to 2 days. If employees have accrued sick leave, you can require them to use that sick leave. What you can't do is require them to use vacation or to go into a debt, to go into a debt for 2 days of sick leave out. So if I'm Jim, I have 5 days of sick leave on the books. I have, need to take 2 days to recover from my shot. You can make me use my 2 days. But if I'm Mary and I use my sick time up, I don't have any others, and Mary needs to take 2 days off to recover from side effects, you're gonna have to give her those up to 2 days. Testing options, I'll talk about sort of what's acceptable. Really the question is, what sorts of tests are going to be available? And generally it's going to be go to a pharmacy, go to a healthcare provider. You can do what I'll call, the take it home test, the sort of rapid tests. However, those have to be administered or at least observed by the employer. So not okay. Jim takes a test at home, sends you an email or calls in and says, yep, I've been tested. I'm clean today. I'm coming in. What would be okay is Jim comes in, Jim does the little swab in the nose, and someone from, the employer's representative looks at it, checks it, records it in the log, check, Jim is cleared to come to work on November 12th. State law is going to vary as to whether you have to pay the cost for this. I think with respect to folks who are receiving accommodations, disability, religion, you are generally going to be on the hook for paying for those tests. It's less clear whether if you just have folks who I would put in I don't have an objection on religion, I don't have a disability, I simply don't want, I'd rather be tested than take the vaccine. You're going to want to look to state law and see what provides there, because you have issues about the cost of the test, the time it takes to take the test. You might have wage and hour, minimum wage issues. So those are things you're going to want to be mindful of. We talked about at-home tests. Finally, what else is required? Notification to employees about the standard, vaccine safety, anti-retaliation protections, and then a copy of CDC information in language at the employees, reasonably calculated to be understood by employees. On accommodation issues, as I said, disability, sincerely held religious belief, both of those are sort of different calculuses, with respect to the disability. In both instances, the employer is required to provide an accommodation if it can do so without undue hardship. The standard under the disability statute is very, very high. I think it's difficult for most big employers to meet that undue hardship standard, where you have someone who needs vaccination because of a disability or can't get vaccinated because of a disability. You may have a little more wiggle room with folks who say, I can't get vaccinated because of my religion. Finally, if folks have unions on the scene, and I don't know that that's going to be many of you, it is something that you potentially will have to bargain with your unit. If it's anything that's required by the government is not necessarily something that you have to bargain the decision. You may have to bargain the effects. But the General Counsel of the NLRB put out a memo about 2 days ago that said, insofar as there are sort of discretion under the standard, am I going to have a mandatory requirement? Am I going to allow folks to test out? What is the frequency of testing? What time off am I going to offer? Any place where the employer has discretion, if you do have a bargaining unit, NLRB is taking the position that you have to bargain both the decision and then ultimately the effects. So I think I have hit 20 minutes. I am going to stop now, and maybe Chad, you can I'll open the chat window, see if we have some questions. But Chad, if you want to moderate or tell me what we've got there so far, I'll be happy to.
We've already got some good questions that are rolling in on the chat. And so if anyone else has some, please jump in there or raise your hand. You can raise your hand button too. Let's take it from the top. So if an employer with over 100 employees has 90% of the staff vaccinated and the 10% that are not vaccinated work remotely, do those 10% still have to do weekly testing?
No. Boy, I love it when I can actually answer a question. No, if given that scenario, you have 100 employees, 90 of them work in the office, 90 of them are vaccinated, you have 10 folks who are doing exclusively remote work. They do not need to be vaccinated. If the scenario was that one of those 10 people needs to come in for the monthly staff meeting, or come to pick something up at the office, whatever it is, that person you'd have to test them within no more than 7 days before they came to the workplace, and they'd have to show proof of a negative to come in. But generally speaking, remote workers are not required to be vaccinated. If they're fully remote, not required to be vaccinated, not required to be tested.
Great. I think you answered this, but we'll go ahead and ask it as well. If you have a testing program, do you have to provide paid time off for the employee to test?
Yeah, that again, I think it turns very much on whether if it's part of that disability or religion accommodation. I think the weight of authority suggests that you do. With respect to if it's not that, if you're simply telling folks you can test, in lieu of getting the vaccination, you're going to want to consult with counsel to make sure you are in line with Oklahoma state wage and hour law. If you have employees working in different, outside of the state of Oklahoma, there are something like 30 different state statutes. 30 states have statutes that either require employers to reimburse for business, any expense incurred as a part of doing business. Some are very specific to medical tests. So it really is, this is one where you're going to want to get with your counsel and make sure, particularly for those of you who may have a large number of employees operating in more than one state, you're going to want to make sure you are in compliance with those various state and local laws.
Great. If you're under 100 employees, does any portion of the ETS apply, or is it all or nothing?
If you are under 100 employees and you are not a federal contractor, that's the only exception. Federal contractors, it's not a function of size, it's a function of, is this language in your contract? Is your work site covered? But if you are not a federal contractor, you have 95 employees as of November 5, this ETS does not apply to you. Again, the caveat is there may be state laws, depending on what state you're in, probably fewer in Oklahoma, but if you're operating a multi-state operation, everywhere from Florida to California is going to give you something different. But no, in general, at least as of this moment, and OSHA has asked, so when they publish this temporary standard, it goes into effect. It also serves as a notice and comment. They're requesting comments on how a final standard, if they adopt one, should be phrased. And they have specifically asked whether that 100 employee threshold should be eliminated, lowered, maintained. But as of this writing, as of this moment, if you are under 100, it's an all or nothing. You are outside the scope of the ETS, and it's not something you need to worry about. Go get a cup of coffee.
Who is held liable if employee is injured or dies from the vaccine?
In the rare, all right, so the question is, if an employee suffers a severe adverse effect, and the numbers are, fortunately, the numbers on that are relatively low. They're not unheard of, but they're relatively low. We've advised that in those positions, if it's the employer requires you to get the shot, you get the shot, you suffer those effects, you're likely looking at a workers' comp claim. That would be something that your workers' comp carrier would cover if we could directly trace that the vaccine was the cause of the injury, and then the causation was the employer required you to get the vaccine. So that's, it's generally going to be workers' comp.
Okay. Just out of curiosity, and again, a little bit off script here, but I have a friend who actually had a very, very severe reaction to the vaccine, and it ended up with some paralysis and a number of really bad effects. There's a federal fund that's set aside for that. Just curious if you have any information on that. It's kind of a secondary follow-up to that question, but I believe there's already a federal fund that's set aside that somebody who has a reaction can apply for kind of some compensation from that. Are you familiar with any of that?
Yes, Chad, I'm familiar with it. I am not well versed in it. I think a month or so ago I might have been, but that's been squeezed out of my brain. But you're right, there is. Yeah. You can only keep so much stuff in the noodle, and that's a month ago someone had asked me about it. But yeah, if you search for that, I think it's the federal vaccine injury compensation or some such. Right. In those rare instances where someone does have, the unfortunate and really, lasting and severe side effect, that's available to them as well. And that's, that's been set up. That existed long before COVID. That I think has been around for a number of years for a number of different reasons. So that is out there. Let's all hope none of us have to look up that information or be, available of it. But you make a good point. These instances are rare, but they are, it's not non-zero.
Right. Yep. Yeah. It's good information for me to know. I didn't know about it. It has been around for quite a long time. Okay. So if anybody else have any other questions, you can either raise your hand or put them in the chat.
I see one other one in the chat that I think is a good question to get to, which is, I talked about if you are over 100, but you have, 10 employees who are working remotely, you're covered, but your 10 remote employees don't need to be vaccinated or tested because they're working remotely. This is sort of a variation on that question. If we are over 100, a portion of staff work remote and another portion work outside. Folks who work exclusively outside are also exempted. If we subtract those out, we are under 100 employees. Are we still covered? And the answer is yes. You count employees. So in terms of counting to 100, you count remote employees, you count employees who work outside, you count part-time employees for purposes of figuring out if you hit that 100. Now, it may be, given that set of facts, I've got a number of people who work at home, I've got a number of people who work outside. When you add everybody up, I'm at 100, so I'm covered, which means the folks in the office need to get, either the vaccinated or subjected to testing. But and let's say it's 50 workers who are not, who are remote, who are working outside, who are working in trucks. Those 50 do not. So you may be in the situation where, I've got 110 employees total, but only 50 of them are coming into the office. That standard is going to only apply to the 50. But for purposes of, do I trigger the threshold count? Yes, you count remote workers, you count outdoor workers, and all of those folks. You count minors. I'm going to scroll down and see what else is in here.
Yeah, there's another question. What is the fine if a company does not comply with the OSHA requirement?
Currently, the fine is about $7,000 per violation, double if it's willful. There is a distinct possibility that those fines may be increased, unrelated to this ETS or COVID, but there are some legislation moving through Congress, a budget bill that may or may not, ultimately come to fruition. But we have seen language in some of those provisions that would dramatically increase some of these OSHA penalties, maybe even by a factor of 10. I wonder now if that was put out there before the ETS. I wonder now if the game is going to be, hey, you're telling these folks if they screw up, they're it's now $70,000 violation. If that's going to maybe throw some cold water on that, because that's, you've got a lot of folks who I think are going to have a hard time stomaching that. We have about 2 minutes left on my clock because we promised 10 and 20. I'm just looking very quickly.
Yeah, a couple more if you want me to just grab at them. So question was, so you're saying that outside workers, for example, construction craftsmen, will not need to proceed with weekly testing? That was the question.
Yes, that's if they are working exclusively outdoors. They must work outdoors on all days. Must not, you can't have folks who are sharing a ride with others. But if you are working exclusively outdoors, say construction craftsmen, you will not need, you are not subject to these requirements. It's a little tricky depending on where you are. I know, it must be truly outdoors. So buildings under construction where most of the substructures in place, walls and ceilings are mostly there. Technically it's still open, it's open air in some instances. I think OSHA is going to say that's not truly outdoors. But if you have someone who's, working the telephone poles or laying cable or driving a truck by themselves solo, and they don't come in or out of the facility, that's important. If you have someone who drives in, gets out of the cab, and then starts to assist in loading or directing, that person is covered. But if you have someone who just, pulls the truck up, someone loads the stuff onto the flat, he drives away, pulls it into the next place, someone else unloads it, he's, essentially never outside that cab except by himself, that person's excluded.
Got one more, we can end with this one. If a company has multiple entities with less than 100 employees each, but they have centralized health and safety, when added together, the entities employ more than 100, are they subject to the ETS?
Probably so. OSHA did not provide great detail on this. Usually they look at a common control test. If you've got a bunch of small, you own a bunch of facilities or you have a bunch of subsidiaries. The single piece of advice they gave in the ETS was if safety and health matters are controlled sort of at the top level, at that common parent level, you are probably 100 for purposes of this standard. It's not the only time you'd be at 100. If you have multiple franchises, depending on how they're structured, depending on how who's controlling the day-to-day operations, you may or may not be considered to be a single employer. The good news is if you are a franchise, you are not rolled up with other franchises that you don't own. You're not rolled up with your brand. But if you are a multi-unit franchise owner and sort of, they might each have a separate LLC or separate EIN, but if all the sort of common work policies and health and safety policies are being set at the top, I think OSHA would take the view that you're covered. So
we got one last popped in, and it's a short one. We'll end with that. Is it true that it doesn't matter if an employee is outside or remote if they're a federal contractor?
I am going to give a qualified yes to that. I have not looked at that point. I have not looked at that single point in particular, but the federal contractor standard is a tougher standard than the private sector. And if you are on that contract or in support of that contract, it's pretty stiff. So yeah, I think I believe this is when you're going to want to, check with your own counsel. But I think if you are a covered contractor under that work, it doesn't matter if you're remote, it doesn't matter if you're outside. In fact, I know with respect to remote, if you're on the contract, you're required to be vaccinated. The one sort of thing they gave was that they're not considering a home office to be a work site for purposes of masking and social distancing and those other things under the XO.
Great. Jim, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you jumping on a webinar with us. And if anyone has any other questions, feel free to email us and we can either try to get with Jim or get you answers on those. You can email your membership representative or just the general email box at the chamber. And then a quick reminder, our next webinar is on November 17th, and we're going to dive into a little study, a national study in Oklahoma's tax structure. We've just got done finishing a pretty comprehensive review of the competitiveness of Oklahoma's tax structure. So Ben from our research foundation will be leading that as well. So again, thank you, everybody. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out. And Jim, thank you for your time.
Thank you for the opportunity. Great to talk to you all. Have a great day.
You
Enjoy
all
the
take
weekend.
care. You as well.